You've heard the word Aryan, right? It's one of the most loaded and misunderstood words in modern history. But what if I told you that its original meaning had absolutely nothing to do with race? Today, we're going to strip away all that modern baggage, go right back to the very beginning, and uncover the true story of the original Aryan.
Okay, so let's get right into it. To answer our big question, what did Aryan originally mean, we have to take a trip back in time. We're talking thousands of years, to the very, very first time this word ever appeared.
And our first stop on this journey is linguistics. Yeah. To find the real meaning, we've got to follow the word's trail all the way back to the ancient seed from which it first sprouted.
So the word's family tree goes way, way back to a root in Proto-Indo-European. Now, this is the prehistoric language that's like the great-great-grandparent of hundreds of languages today, from Hindi all the way to English. Scholars have pieced this root together as ash to airyo, but what's really interesting is that nobody agrees on exactly what it meant. It's still up for debate.
And just look at what scholars have proposed. We've got ideas like to assemble skillfully, hospitable, or allied, friendly. Now here is the crucial part. Notice what's missing? Not a single one of these original theories has anything, and I mean anything, to do with race or biology. It's all about actions, skills, or how you treat people.
So the first time we actually see this word written down is in two ancient and closely related languages. In Vedic Sanskrit, it pops up as ārya, and in Avestan, the language of ancient Iranian texts, it's airya. These are our first real solid clues.
And this leads us to a really key finding. The word shows up in ancient India and Iran, right? But it's absent from the other branches of the Indo-European family, like Greek or Latin or the Germanic languages. And this is a huge deal. It tells us this wasn't some universal name for an ancient ancestor group. Nope, it was a specific cultural term, used only by the Indo-Iranian peoples.
Okay, so if it's a cultural term, what exactly was that culture? Who were these first people to call themselves Arya?
But when you look at the earliest texts, like the Rigveda, they don't define Arya by what people looked like. Not at all. Instead, they draw a contrast between the Arya and other groups, like the Dasa or Dasyu. And the dividing line was all about culture and ritual. The Arya were the folks who followed specific religious practices, while the Dasa were rival groups who, well, they just did things differently.
I mean, listen to this quote from the scholar Michael Witzel. He just nails it. Being Arya wasn't about who your parents were. It was about the community you were part of, the language you spoke, and the rituals you performed. It was a cultural club, not a bloodline.
And get this, it wasn't just in India. We see the exact same pattern in ancient Iran. Their sacred texts draw a line between the ārya, the insiders, and the ārya, the outsiders. This parallel just confirms it was a shared Indo-Iranian idea about who was in the group, culturally speaking.
But it gets even deeper than that. The term wasn't just about what group you were in. It started to say something about who you were as a person. It became a mark of moral and spiritual excellence.
And here's something fascinating. There's a line from the Rigveda itself that says a divine power belongs to both the Aryans and the Dasas. This shows that the line between them wasn't some uncrossable wall. It suggests they were both seen as part of a bigger human, or maybe even divine, family.
So here's the big takeaway. Arya status wasn't something you were just born with. It was something you could become. It was defined by your actions, by right conduct and spiritual practice. It was an honor you earned.
This quote from the Bhagavata Purana makes it crystal clear. It says that anyone, even someone born of a low family, could be considered the best of the Arya family just through their devotion. See? It's about what you do, not where you come from.
And this idea has a long legacy, echoing right into the modern era. As the philosopher Swami Vivekananda put it, being an Arya is about being born in spirituality, not just physically born. It's a statement about your inner character.
So, we've established this non-racial cultural meaning. How did it hold up over time? Well, it turns out its meaning as a term of honor was remarkably stable for thousands of years. You can literally trace this unbroken thread through history. It starts as this cultural label in the Vedic period. Then you see powerful Persian kings like Darius the Great calling themselves Arya. Fast forward to medieval India, and it's being used as a polite way to address someone, kind of like saying sir or madam. The meaning stays consistent, noble, honorable, part of the culture.
And this cultural idea got so strong that it became tied to actual places on a map. In India, you have Aryavarta, the land of the Aryas, which was the heartland of that civilization. And over in Persia, the word Iran, meaning of the Aryas, eventually gave us the modern name for the country, Iran. Pretty cool, right?
And it's not just in dusty old texts or royal decrees. The word is woven into the very fabric of South Asia's great epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. It's used all the time as a term of respect for heroes, nobles, and honorable characters.
All right, so we've followed this trail through linguistics, religion, and thousands of years of history. What does it all boil down to? What's the final verdict?
Well, it's this. For over 3,000 years, the word had a clear, stable, and consistent meaning. It was an identity marker for sure, but one that was based on shared culture, shared language, and shared beliefs. It was never, ever about race.
So, it all kicks off with this idea called the Aryan Invasion Theory. For the longest time, this was the story everyone believed. A powerful, light-skinned race called the Aryans supposedly swept into ancient India and conquered the local, dark-skinned population. But, as we're about to see, this entire narrative was built on a foundation of misinterpretations and, well, outright fabrications.
So where did such a huge idea even come from? Well, you might be surprised. It didn't start on a battlefield. It started in a library, with linguists who were studying ancient texts.
This timeline really lays out how it all began. Back in the late 1700s, a scholar named Sir William Jones had this lightbulb moment. He realized that ancient languages like Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin were all related. A few years later, he translated the Sanskrit word ārya simply as noble. Then, in the 1860s, another hugely influential scholar, Max Muller, started using the word Aryan as a catch-all term for this whole family of languages.
And this is absolutely crucial to understand. Muller himself couldn't have been more clear about it. He said over and over again that when he used the word Aryan, he was talking about language. It had nothing to do with race, not with blood, not with bones, not with anything physical. It was a linguistic category, period. But here's where it all goes wrong. Even though he was so clear in his scholarly work, Muller would casually talk about our Aryan ancestors. That kind of language, mixed with the intense nationalism brewing in 19th century Europe, was like a spark on dry tinder. People latched onto the idea of an Aryan people, a distinct biological race. And just like that, a linguistic term was twisted into a racial one.
Okay, so you've got an idea, a theory. But to make it really stick, you need proof, right? Well, in the 1940s, it seemed like archaeologists found the smoking gun.
This is where archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler enters the picture. While digging at the ancient city of Mohenjo-Daro, he found a bunch of skeletons that hadn't been properly buried. And he made this incredibly dramatic claim. He basically put the ancient Vedic god Indra on trial, accusing him and his Aryan followers of a violent massacre that wiped out the entire Indus Valley civilization.
But then, years later, another archaeologist named George Dales took a much closer look at the evidence, and Wheeler's whole story just fell apart. The claim was that the skeletons were victims of one big massacre. The reality? The bones were actually from totally different time periods, meaning they were left there over many, many years. There was no single violent event.
And when you really dig into the details, the whole massacre theory just crumbles. First off, the skeletons were found in different layers of earth, a dead giveaway they died at different times. And get this, some of them had injuries that had clearly healed long before they died. Plus, this was the only site where anyone found anything remotely like this. The final nail in the coffin? Wheeler himself eventually admitted that his theory just couldn't be proven.
So, with the archaeological proof totally debunked, the investigation turns to a new tool: modern science. Genetics gives us this incredible ability to look back in time and see what really happened. This is where things get really fascinating. Thanks to amazing advances in studying ancient DNA, we don't have to guess anymore. We can actually look at the genes of the people who lived in the Indus Valley and ask a very simple question. Is there any trace of these so-called Aryan invaders from the Eurasian steppe?
And the answer we got back? It's just one number: 0. 0%. That's the amount of DNA from the Eurasian steppe, the supposed Aryan homeland, found in the remains at the Harappan site of Rakhigarhi. None.
Now, what this means is huge. It tells us that the people from the steppe couldn't have been the invaders who destroyed the Harappan civilization, because they weren't even there yet. They arrived on the scene much, much later, long after the great cities of the Indus Valley had already gone into decline for other reasons. And it doesn't stop there. The story gets even more complex. Geneticists also found the remains of someone in Central Asia who actually had South Asian ancestry. This proves that people weren't just moving in one direction. It was a two-way street, with people moving back and forth. That completely shatters the simple story of a one-way invasion. Okay, so the archaeology doesn't hold up. The genetics tells a totally different story. But what if the biggest, most fundamental flaw in this whole theory was hiding in plain sight from the very beginning, right there in the word itself? So let's go back to the source. What did ārya actually mean to the people who used it? Well, in the original Sanskrit texts, it was never, ever a racial term. It was a social and cultural label. It meant someone who was noble or honorable, someone who followed the right customs and rituals. It was a status you could achieve, not a race you were born into.
And this brings us to the core logical contradiction that makes the whole theory impossible. Let's break it down. For the invasion theory to work, Aryan has to be a racial term for a group of invaders. But the supposed invader's own sacred text, the Rigveda, uses the exact same word to describe a cultural status that anyone could adopt. You see the problem? Those two meanings can't both be true. A word that's inclusive and cultural can't also be exclusive and racial. The whole argument just collapses.
And this is where the story takes its final, darkest turn. This is how a simple academic error, born from a mistranslation, spiraled into an ideology of pure hatred and mass murder. You can see the horrifying progression right here. It started in the 1850s with racist writers like Gobineau, who declared the Aryan race was the best of all. Then at the end of the century, others chimed in, claiming Germanic people were the purest Aryans. And of course, this all culminated with Adolf Hitler, who took this twisted idea and made it the absolute cornerstone of Nazi ideology in his book, Mein Kampf.
I mean, just look at this contrast. It's staggering. A word that meant noble became master race. A term for being culturally adherent was warped into racial purity. An inclusive social idea was twisted into an exclusive biological category used to decide who had the right to live and who deserved to die.
And the human cost of this lie, well, it's almost impossible to comprehend. More than 15 million people, Jews, Slavs, Roma, people with disabilities, and so many others, all systematically murdered by the Nazi regime in the name of preserving the purity of this imaginary Aryan race.
And that's the ultimate sickening absurdity of it all, isn't it? A word from an ancient Indian text, a word that originally stood for moral character and cultural honor, was stolen, twisted, and weaponized to justify one of the most evil acts in all of human history.
So, what if a really famous historical theory, one that literally shaped how we understand an entire civilization, was all built on a single fundamental misunderstanding? Today, we're going to dive right into that question as we explore the Aryan Paradox.
I mean, really think about that for a second. What if a story we've all been told about ancient history, a story that shaped politics and identity for centuries, was based on just a simple but profound misinterpretation of a single word? Let's unpack that. Okay, so first things first, let's get on the same page about what we're talking about, the Aryan Invasion Theory. The classic version goes like this. A distinct racial group called Aryans swept into India, conquered everybody, and brought with them the Vedic culture and the Sanskrit language. This has been a super popular narrative for a long time, but as we're about to see, it's a narrative that's absolutely riddled with contradictions.
Now, the source material we're looking at argues that this theory doesn't just lack evidence. It's got several fatal flaws, contradictions so big they make the whole thing logically impossible. Let's walk through some of the most critical ones.
The first one, and maybe the most devastating one, comes from the word at the very center of it all, Aryan. The entire theory, I mean the whole shebang, hinges on this word meaning a specific race of people.
And this right here perfectly illustrates the problem. In the original Vedic texts, the term ārya is all about a cultural or religious identity. It's about what you believe and how you act, a status anyone could achieve. The invasion theory, on the other hand, needs Aryan to mean a racial group that you're born into. You see? These two definitions are complete opposites. They just can't both be true. So the crucial point is, the theory is built on a meaning that the original texts themselves just don't support.
Okay, so the language part doesn't really hold up, but what about physical evidence? For a massive invasion and conquest, you'd expect to find some pretty clear proof in the ground, right? You know, signs of a huge war, destruction, a total break in the archaeological record. Well, the evidence just isn't there.
The only supposed proof was this old theory of a massacre at a place called Mohenjo-Daro, but that was completely debunked decades ago. Scientific analysis showed the skeletons were from different time periods, with zero signs of a single violent event, like an invasion. A theory of an invasion with no evidence of an invasion, that's a major problem.
The lack of archaeological evidence is a huge blow to the theory. But the contradictions don't stop there. Think about it. If a conquering army destroyed the great Harappan civilization, you would expect their culture to be totally wiped out and replaced. But is that what we see?
Not at all. In fact, we see a remarkable amount of cultural continuity. From city planning and farming methods to wedding ceremonies and even the namaste gesture, key parts of Harappan culture just kept on going. And what's more, artifacts from Harappan sites, like fire altars and seals showing yogic poses, suggest that core Vedic and Hindu practices were already there. This looks a lot less like a replacement and a lot more like an evolution.
Now for a contradiction that's literally locked in time, and it involves a river. The Rigveda, supposedly the foundational text brought by these invaders, talks all the time, in glowing terms, about the mighty Saraswati River.
And here is the paradox. Geological and satellite data show the Saraswati River had pretty much dried up by around 1900 BCE. The invasion is dated to 1500 BCE. So how could invaders arriving in 1500 BCE write these amazing hymns about a glorious river that had vanished from the landscape 400 years earlier? The only logical answer is that the people who wrote the Vedas were living there when the river was still flowing, long before the supposed invasion ever happened.
So we've seen that the evidence, from linguistics to archaeology, it just doesn't support the Aryan Invasion Theory. Which begs the question, where did this idea even come from? Well, the answer, it seems, isn't found in ancient history, but in the politics of the 19th century.
This theory wasn't born out of objective evidence. It was an ideological idea that served a purpose. It fit perfectly with European colonial stories, creating a framework to understand and, well, control India's history. And here's what made it so useful. The theory created a historical excuse for colonial rule. If India's golden age was kicked off by earlier, lighter-skinned invaders from the north, then the British were just the latest in a long line of civilizing forces. It was a powerful justification, all rooted in a racialized way of looking at history.
So, what do scholars think today? Has this old invasion model been replaced? The answer is a big, definitive yes.
For the last several decades, the academic world has moved way beyond this simplistic and totally unsupported idea of a racial invasion. The word invasion itself is now seen by most serious scholars as a straw man, not a real academic position.
Today's consensus is way more nuanced. It acknowledges that people migrated, but it wasn't a racial conquest. The key points are, Aryan was a cultural term, not a racial one. There was no large-scale invasion. Language and culture likely spread through small migrating groups and were adopted by local elites. Vedic culture is a blend, a mix of immigrant and local cultures, and genetic evidence shows people were moving and mixing in both directions. It's a story of diffusion and mixing, not destruction and replacement.
So this modern, more nuanced understanding really helps us resolve that central paradox we started with. How did a simple cultural term get so twisted?
You can really trace the journey here. It began as a term for a cultural insider in the ancient texts. Then, in the 19th century, scholars misinterpreted it as a linguistic label. From there, it got completely distorted and weaponized into a pseudoscientific racial category with some truly catastrophic consequences. And so we're back at the core of the problem, the paradox itself. The invasion theory requires Aryan to mean race. The historical reality is that ārya meant culture. The two simply cannot be reconciled. The theory is built on a logical contradiction. So in the end, the whole structure rests on some seriously faulty foundations. A misreading of the main term, a debunked archaeological claim, and a political agenda from the colonial era.
This quote really says it all. The problem isn't just that there's a lack of evidence, it's that the theory itself just doesn't make any logical sense when you look at its core premise.
And that is the ultimate paradox. The key to dismantling the entire theory is hiding in plain sight, right inside the very word it was built on. Understanding what Aryan originally meant is all it takes for the entire invasion narrative to just collapse.
It leaves us with a final, really important question. The story of the word Aryan is a powerful cautionary tale. It shows how language can be manipulated to build entire historical narratives, and it makes you wonder, What other historical facts that we accept might be resting on a similarly shaky foundation? It's a good reminder to always question the stories we're told and to always look for the evidence.